Picking up where we left off in part 2 of the lecture, we see this image on the cultural landscape in Ireland that reflects what they call a genocide by starvation. Again, this example of Ireland in the 1840s highlights food access versus food supply. Ireland was producing more food than they needed. They were exporting food to England and throughout the British Empire, but the Irish population was starving because their food was restricted. They were not able to own land, so they were tenant farmers working on English plantations, on English farms, and they were only able to produce on small plots of land potatoes for personal consumption. And when that potato crop failed, they were left with very few options. So the Irish diaspora, again, was the movement of people, the mass movement, really against their will, out of Ireland to different parts of the world. A more recent example occurred in Ethiopia in the 1980s, and again we look at food supply versus power. Ethiopia is a country located in East Africa that in the 1980s was experiencing what was called the Red Terror. The country was in the midst of a civil war, and there was also a prolonged drought. Now the drought led to crop failure, and international aid was organized. Money and food was sent to Ethiopia to help mitigate the famine. But what we found as more international agencies was involved was actually a social issue. So yes, the drought caused crop failure, caused a reduction in food supply. But what we also saw was that a dictator in place was moving around the population. So people that were political opponents, 150,000 people died because they were relocated to a different part of the country. They were relocated to parts of the country where crops were failing, where food production was low or non-existent. So during this Red Terror, about 500,000 people died, but in the years following the initial drought, we found that politics and a brutal dictator played as much of a role as the actual lack of rainfall. So over time, Ethiopia was able to bounce back. Today, with a more transparent government, we see that Ethiopia is in a stage 2. Its population is growing again. But we saw this bottleneck in the 1980s that reflected a drought and then also political conflict. So while money and food was getting sent into Ethiopia in the 1980s, much of that was held for political allies, for one side of what ultimately was a civil war. Closer to home, we see issues with food supply occurring in our food deserts. Food deserts are parts of our communities that don't have access to fresh food. And while we look around the world and we see these other historic examples, much of our focus today is what's happening right in our backyards. So this map on the right shows us Baltimore City, and we could see on this map different what we call healthy food priority areas. These areas are food deserts, and in urban areas a food desert is defined as a community that is beyond 1 mile from its nearest grocery store. And in a city, you don't think about this being an issue. You don't think about access to grocery stores being an issue. But in cities like Baltimore and cities all across the United States, we find these urban food deserts. In our urban food deserts, we usually don't see an issue with people being undernourished, meaning they're not getting enough calories. What we see in our food deserts are high levels of malnutrition. The calories that the populations are taking in are not healthy calories. So it's a bit ironic that in places where we don't have access to food, that we have increased obesity, diabetes, heart disease. And this reflects, again, the type of calories that people are consuming. So within our food deserts, we see that it's not just a small part of the U.S. population. We see that millions of people, over 20 million people, are actually living in these food deserts. Again, closer to home, the map on the right shows us that almost a quarter of Baltimore City residents are living in a food desert. Think about, for a moment, how important quality food is, right? If we want to do well in school, if we want to do well at work, if we want to build positive relationships, eating well is part of that. Some of the solutions that are currently being investigated and implemented to combat food deserts include the expansion of supermarkets. So in many low-income neighborhoods, what we're finding is the redevelopment or the development of supermarkets. So you might see a part of a neighborhood that it went into decline, has been razed or leveled or torn down, and in its place is a small supermarket and maybe a couple other, like a pharmacy, a small strip mall. Supermarkets are the easiest way, when applicable, to get fresh food into neighborhoods. We're also seeing farmers markets pop up. So this works for both the consumer and the supplier. It provides an outlet for our local farmers to sell their products directly to consumers. We also see the growth of EBT, or food stamps, and this is a really important trend that we're seeing in farmers markets, where individuals who are receiving food stamps as part of an income supplement are able to use those at farmers markets. So this really 21st century innovation has really been profound in a lot of our food deserts. The ability to match low-income populations with a steady food supply, allowing to match our local farmers with a steady consumer base. So farmers markets have become increasingly valuable. Now, a limit to farmers markets, particularly in this part of the country, is our growing season. So farmers markets are somewhat limited in the winter. We see a big decline in the number of farmers markets offered during our winter months. Urban farming has been more of a trend in the 21st century. We see urban farming occurring in a lot of gentrifying neighborhoods as well. Urban farming looks at using existing plots of green space to grow and supplement our local consumption. We haven't seen urban farming be able to feed populations, but we have seen urban farming be able to add nutritious calories to local populations. And when we look at overcoming food deserts, a big concern is culture, right? I mean, it's easy to go into a store and grab something that tastes good, something that's convenient, something that is non-perishable, a bag of chips, a candy bar. So one of the things that we're facing in not only implementing fresh food into food deserts, another obstacle is overcoming a culture of not eating healthy, nutritious foods. So our food deserts are one of our bigger social concerns in our cities today. Our rural areas also face food deserts. So when we look at this 20 plus million Americans that are living in food deserts, while the majority of those Americans are living in our urban areas, we also have food deserts in rural areas where our rural populations are lacking access to fresh food. So these solutions, supermarkets, farmers markets, urban farming, they could all mitigate the food desert, but it's going to take a broader cultural change as well to grow our demand for healthy and nutritious foods. There is a link to a TED Talk posted to Blackboard that looks at an example of how an individual named Ron Finley, somebody who's not a farmer, somebody who's actually in an industry outside of farming, how he looked at an issue of food deserts in South Central Los Angeles, and how he looked at a way to get people involved. He found that we need to change the system and we need to change the culture. So not only do we need to make fresh food available, but we also have to change what fresh food and what nutritious food means to people. So he implemented these ideas around food forests, where food is part of the solution, meaning that we're going to get individuals involved in urban farming. We're going to get individuals involved in creating their own food, part of the system. And when we make people part of the system, they have a greater attachment to the food production and also consumption. So he's looking, again, not only is food is the problem where we don't have it, he's looking at changing the culture, growing our own food, being part of the solution individually, not just opening up a supermarket, but also helping grow fresh food, helping being part of that production system. So I think you'll enjoy this TED Talk. It's a very interesting look at what one place, one of America's largest cities, is doing to combat food deserts and be part of a bigger cultural shift.